History Holes.
Welcome back to History Holes. Part 1, The Two Republics, 1955 to 1960. In 1954, the guns at Dien Bien Phu fell silent, and the great powers, meeting in Geneva, drew a line on a map. At the 17th parallel, Vietnam was cut in two. This division, they said, was temporary, a 2-year pause before a national election would reunify the country. But that election would never come. Instead, this temporary line hardened into one of the most fortified and ideologically charged borders on Earth, giving birth to two rival states, two separate destinies, and setting the stage for a catastrophic new war. A temporary division becomes permanent. The immediate consequence of the partition was a massive, chaotic exodus. In the North, the new communist government had to consolidate its power, but in the South, a new nation was being forged in a crucible of fear and migration. Nearly 1 million people, the vast majority of them Northern Catholics, fearing religious persecution under the communists, fled south in a massive relocation effort supported by the U.S. Navy. At the same time, a smaller, but politically vital, group of around 90,000 Southern revolutionaries, the regroupees, obediently marched north, leaving their homes to build the new socialist state, but fully expecting to return. This two-way transfer wasn't just a movement of people. It was a profound demographic and political unmixing that solidified the ideological divide. Building the South, into this southern chaos stepped Ngo Dinh Diem, an austere, uncompromising nationalist and devout Catholic. Appointed prime minister by Bao Dai, he arrived in Saigon in 1954 to find a government that barely existed. The city was not his to command. It was controlled by a bizarre patchwork of rivals. There was the Binh Xuyen, a criminal syndicate that ran the city's police force, and in the countryside, the powerful Cao Dai and Hoa Hao religious sects commanded their own private armies. With crucial American backing, Diem did the unthinkable. In a series of swift, brutal urban battles in 1955, he crushed the Binh Xuyen. He then turned his army on the sects, breaking their power and forcing their leaders into submission or exile. In just over a year, Diem had consolidated his power, pushed Bao Dai aside in a rigged referendum, and, refusing to hold the 1956 reunification elections, he declared the establishment of the Republic of Vietnam. It was a state built in his own image, fiercely anti-communist, authoritarian, and dominated by his own family, particularly his brothers Ngo Dinh Nhu and Ngo Dinh Thuc. Building the North. While Diem was building his nationalist state, Hanoi was engaged in its own ruthless consolidation. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, launched a brutal land reform campaign to destroy the old social order. Following the Chinese model, cadres were sent into villages to orchestrate people's tribunals, inciting poor peasants to rise up against their landlords and even rich or middle peasants. The campaign, which was supervised by Chinese advisors, shattered the traditional village structure. Thousands were executed or imprisoned, many of them loyal Viet Minh supporters who were now tragically branded as class enemies. By 1956, the campaign's excesses had led to widespread unrest, even in Catholic areas that had not fled south. While the party leadership, including Ho Chi Minh, would later admit to errors and launch a rectification campaign, their goal was achieved. The old class of village notables was eliminated, and the party's control over the rural population was now absolute. This control was extended to the cities, where intellectuals who had dared to call for more freedom during the Nan Vun Giai Phum affair were silenced, imprisoned, or forced into public self-criticism. The decision to return to war. In the South, Diem's Denounce Communists Tokong campaign mirrored the North's repression, targeting not just communists but anyone opposed to his regime. The thousands of cadres the party had left behind were hunted, imprisoned, and killed. Facing annihilation, the Southern Communists pleaded with Hanoi to authorize a return to armed struggle. For years, Hanoi resisted, prioritizing the construction of socialism in the North. But by 1959, the pressure was too much. The party's Central Committee passed the pivotal Resolution 15, giving the green light for a full-scale insurgency in the South. The following year, in December 1960, Hanoi announced the creation of the National Liberation Front, NLF. The world would soon come to know them as the Viet Cong. The Second Indochina War had begun. Part 2, Escalation and Collapse, 1960 to 1964. The establishment of the National Liberation Front transformed the conflict from a low-level repression into a full-scale insurgency. In Washington, the new administration of President John F. Kennedy saw South Vietnam not as a post-colonial nation, but as a critical domino in the global Cold War. Determined to prove American resolve, Kennedy embraced a new doctrine of flexible response, rejecting all-out nuclear war in favor of counterinsurgency. This meant a massive influx of American support for Diem. The number of U.S. advisors swelled from a few hundred to over 16,000. They weren't just training troops, they were directing the war. New technologies like the helicopter were introduced to give Saigon's army unprecedented mobility. At the same time, Diem's regime, with American advice, launched the disastrous Strategic Hamlet program. The plan was to pacify the countryside by forcibly relocating millions of peasants from their ancestral villages into fortified compounds, theoretically separating them from the NLF. In practice, it was a colossal failure. It severed the sacred tie between the peasants and their land, and, by fencing them in, created a captive and deeply resentful audience for NLF propaganda. The Buddhist Crisis, 1963. While Diem was losing the countryside, he was about to lose the cities. The regime's long-standing favoritism toward the Catholic minority finally exploded into open revolt in May 1963. In the old imperial capital of Hue, government officials, citing a minor ordinance, banned the flying of Buddhist flags during the celebration of Buddha's birthday. Just days earlier, Catholic flags had flown freely for a celebration honoring Diem's brother, Archbishop Tuk. The hypocrisy ignited the Buddhist majority. Peaceful protests were met with gunfire from government troops, killing 9 unarmed civilians. The crisis escalated for weeks, culminating in a moment that seared itself into the world's conscience. On a busy Saigon street, a monk named Thich Quang Duc calmly sat down, had fellow monks douse him in gasoline, and set himself on fire. His act of self-immolation was a horrifying, silent protest against the regime's persecution. Diem's sister-in-law, the acerbic Madame Nhu, dismissed it as a barbecue, a comment that sealed the regime's moral bankruptcy in the eyes of the world. The crisis climaxed when Diem's brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, ordered his loyal special forces to conduct brutal, nationwide raids on Buddhist pagodas, arresting thousands of monks and nuns. The 1963 coup. For the Kennedy administration, the Buddhist crisis was the last straw. The brutal pagoda raids, broadcast worldwide, were a public relations disaster. It was now clear that Diem, far from being the solution, was the problem. His war against his own people was costing them the war against the communists. In Washington, a new consensus emerged. Diem had to go. Through a series of clandestine messages, the U.S. government gave a green light to a group of dissident South Vietnamese generals to stage a coup. On November 1, 1963, the generals made their move. After a brief but violent siege of the presidential palace, Diem and his brother Nhu escaped, only to be captured the following morning. They were unceremoniously executed in the back of an armored personnel carrier, a bloody end to their 9-year rule. The revolving door of chaos. The Americans had hoped the coup would bring stability and a renewed focus on the war effort. They got the exact opposite. With Diem and Nhu's authoritarian regime gone, the entire political structure of South Vietnam collapsed. The country was plunged into a dizzying power vacuum. The generals who had staged the coup, led by the popular but indecisive Dung Van Minh, Big Min, were almost immediately overthrown by another general, the ambitious Nguyen Khanh, just a few months later. Saigon became a revolving door of military juntas, with one coup following another. This period of profound political chaos was precisely what Hanoi had been hoping for. With the southern government in disarray, the NLF made massive gains in the countryside, bringing the Republic of Vietnam to the very brink of collapse. It was clear that without a drastic direct intervention, the war would be lost. Part 3. The American War 1965 to 1968. The chaos in Saigon, with its endless carousel of coups, brought the Republic of Vietnam to the edge of total collapse. For the United States, which had invested billions in the country, this was an unacceptable outcome. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson, inheriting the crisis, was determined not to be the president who lost Vietnam. He just needed a reason to go all in. He got one in August 1964. In a murky series of events in the Gulf of Tonkin, the U.S. destroyer Maddox was allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Using this ambiguous incident as proof of unprovoked northern aggression, Johnson secured the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress. This resolution was a functional blank check, granting him the authority to use all necessary measures to repel any attack, in effect, a declaration of war. Johnson unleashed American power in stages. He first authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained, massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam, intended to cripple its economy and break its will. But these bombing raids required air bases, and those air bases required protection. In March 1965, the first official U.S. combat troops, a contingent of Marines, landed on the beaches of Da Nang to defend the airbase there. The advisor phase was over. The American ground war had begun, a war of attrition. With the arrival of combat troops came a new commander, General William Westmoreland, and a new strategy, search and destroy. Westmoreland believed the U.S. could win a war of attrition. His goal was to reach the crossover point, to kill enemy soldiers faster than Hanoi could replace them. This strategy, reliant on helicopter mobility and overwhelming firepower, turned the war into a grim, numbers-driven contest measured in body counts. Opposing this was Hanoi's strategy of Truong Ki Khang Chien, a protracted people's war. They would bleed the Americans, fighting on their own terms, using guerrilla tactics, booby traps, and ambushes. They fed their war effort through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a logistical marvel of jungle paths, tunnels, and way stations running through neighboring Laos and Cambodia, funneling hundreds of thousands of troops and tons of supplies south. Meanwhile, the revolving door in Saigon finally stopped spinning in 1965, when a cabal of young military officers, led by Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky and General Nguyen Van Thieu, seized power, forming a relatively stable military government that would rule the South for the next decade. The Tet Offensive 1968. By late 1967, General Westmoreland was publicly claiming victory, telling the American people he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. That tunnel was about to collapse. On January 30th, 1968, during Tet, the Lunar New Year and Vietnam's most sacred holiday, Hanoi launched the single most audacious operation of the war. Over 80,000 communist troops, violating the traditional holiday truce, launched a massive, coordinated offensive, striking over 100 cities and towns at the exact same time, from the demilitarized zone, DMZ, to the Mekong Delta. The scale and shock were breathtaking. In Saigon, a commando team breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy, leading to a chaotic televised firefight on the embassy grounds. In the ancient capital of Hue, communist forces seized the imperial citadel and held it for nearly a month in brutal house-to-house fighting. A victorious defeat. In purely military terms, the Tet Offensive was a catastrophic defeat for the communists. The National Liberation Front, NLF forces who did the bulk of the fighting, were decimated. They had failed to hold a single city, and the popular uprising they had hoped to inspire in the South never happened. But as a political and psychological blow, it was one of the most stunning victories in modern history. The offensive shattered the illusion of American progress. It proved that no part of South Vietnam was secure, and that the enemy was far from beaten. The American public, betrayed and exhausted, turned decisively against the war. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, famously declared the war mired in stalemate. President Johnson, his credibility and presidency destroyed, went on national television on March 31, 1968. He announced a halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, and that he would not seek re-election. The Tet Offensive had broken the will of the American government to win the war. Part 4, Vietnamization and Reunification, 1969 to 1975. The Tet Offensive broke the American will to win the war and ended the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. His successor, Richard Nixon, came to power promising peace with honor. His strategy was Vietnamization. This new policy was a two-pronged approach. First, begin the gradual withdrawal of U.S. ground troops to quiet the massive anti-war protests at home. Second, pour billions of dollars in equipment and training into the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, building it up to fight the war on its own. But Vietnamization did not mean de-escalation. To protect the withdrawing American forces, and more importantly, to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Nixon expanded the war, authorizing a secret, massive bombing campaign and a ground invasion of neighboring Cambodia in 1970. The move, far from ending the war, destabilized the entire region and ignited a new firestorm of protest back in the United States. The 1972 Easter Offensive. By 1972, Hanoi decided to test Nixon's new policy. Believing the ARVN was a paper tiger propped up only by American soldiers, they launched the Easter Offensive. This was not a guerrilla campaign. It was a full-blown, conventional invasion with hundreds of tanks and heavy artillery pouring across the DMZ. The ARVN divisions, initially overwhelmed, bent and then broke, fleeing in panic. They were saved from total collapse by one thing: a ferocious and devastating display of American air power. Nixon unleashed Operation Linebacker, sending waves of B-52 bombers to pound northern targets and decimate the invading army. The offensive was a military failure for Hanoi, but it proved two crucial things. The ARVN on its own could not survive, and the war was still an incredibly costly stalemate. Both sides were finally ready to sign a deal. The Paris Peace Accords, 1973. After months of grueling, secret negotiations between National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Hanoi's Le Duc Tho, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. On the surface, it was peace with honor. The United States would withdraw all its remaining troops and get its prisoners of war back. But the treaty contained a fatal, non-negotiable concession demanded by Hanoi. Over 150,000 North Vietnamese regular troops were allowed to remain in their positions inside South Vietnam. President Thieu in Saigon was horrified. He knew this wasn't a peace treaty. It was a death warrant, a guarantee of a future, unwinnable war. But with American aid as leverage and Nixon promising to respond with full force if the North violated the treaty, he was forced to sign. The final offensive, 1975. For 2 years, a tense, uneasy quiet held. But in Washington, the U.S. government was paralyzed. The Watergate scandal had destroyed Nixon's presidency, and a new, war-weary Congress cut military aid to Saigon. In early 1975, Hanoi decided to test America's resolve by attacking a provincial capital. The U.S. did nothing. This was the green light. They launched the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, what they expected to be a 2-year offensive to win the war. The result was a collapse so sudden and total it stunned the world. The ARVN, riddled with corruption, low on fuel and ammunition, and with no American air power to save it, disintegrated. It wasn't a battle, it was a rout. Province after province fell in a matter of days, not weeks. The North Vietnamese army, sensing total victory, raced down the coast. In a matter of just 55 days, they were at the gates of Saigon. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese T-54 tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. The long, brutal 30-year war was over. Vietnam, at last, was unified under a single government. I thank you very much for joining us on this journey. Please leave a like and subscribe if you want more. If you feel like it, tell us what else you'd like to hear. See you on the next episode.